The Chicago Blackhawks have fired their head coach, Luke Richardson. The Rangers are in the process of firing their captain, Jacob Trouba. And the Islanders could be on a verge of making big changes as well. All on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone, and thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner from Locked On Flyers. I'm here each and every Friday with Gil Martin of Locked On Islanders. And keep the season going with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, Gil, I guess, unless you're an Islanders or Rangers fan.
Yeah, it's not an easy day in New York if you're a hockey fan, that's for sure, but we have made it to the weekend, and I'll take that.
Yeah, I'm sure the Devils fans are just cackling right now, as they are wont to do. But the top story, of course, is the Chicago Blackhawks firing head coach Luke Richardson. And Jack Bushman of Locked On Blackhawks had something to say about it.
Holy jump in, the Chicago Blackhawks have fired head coach Luke Richardson. Anders Sorensen, the now former Ice Hogs head coach, steps in as the Blackhawks interim. Not a move I thought the Blackhawks front office was going to make during the season. I did think it was something they were going to do after the year, though, because it had become pretty clear that Luke Richardson wasn't the right guy for this rebuild. He does do some good things defensively, and I thought he established a good culture, but he just wasn't the right guy for where the Blackhawks were trying to go. And based on the moves they made in the offseason, the timeline of the rebuild, it was time to take a step in the right direction this year. Not playoff aspirations, and that's why I thought they were going to let him go until the end of the year. But with Connor Bedard struggling, the offense being absolutely pitiful, kind of the same narrative night in and night out, I understand why Kyle Davidson ultimately went in a different direction. For more of my thoughts on Luke Richardson's firing, be sure to check out tonight's episode of Locked On Blackhawks.
So that was definitely a take on the firing of Luke Richardson. I think that outside of Chicago, at least from my perspective, I really think that it was a more obvious firing than that. That I do not think the Blackhawks should have waited until the end of the season here, just because I think the Connor Bedard not making Team Canada for Four Nations was a huge wake-up call and kind of the straw that broke the camel's back here. Because if Luke Richardson couldn't guide this Blackhawks team to showcase their generational talent in an effective manner in order for him to make a national team for Canada, like, what are we doing here, right?
I think that was telling, and his lack of progress more than anything else. I mean, lots of players have sophomore slumps. Usually you show what you could do, the league adjusts to it, they scout you, and then you have to counter move to keep yourself at that really high level. And right now, that isn't happening. And to see Bedard struggle the way he is in year two, I think that had more to do with the dismissal of Luke Richardson, because there's a lot of young talent on this team, but it is built around Connor Bedard, and his failure to take that next step forward, I think, was the biggest reason that the Blackhawks decided to make this move.
Right. And I think with young player development, when you have a guy that makes the NHL at 18 or 19, their player development process, I don't care how good you are, is going to look a lot different than it does for other guys, where they have extra years in junior or college hockey or the AHL or whatever. They get to hone their game in a little bit more of a sheltered environment. When you go straight to the NHL, you got to do it in front of all the lights, right? And it is a much more difficult process. And I think you need the right coach to do that. But it's also not the same task as doing a rebuild for an entire team. And some coaches are not suited to do both of those things at the same time. And I think that's another thing that affected Luke Richardson here, that he either had to pick focusing entirely on Bedard or the whole team. and neither of them worked.
Yeah, it just wasn't happening. And look, I think that Jack expressed it well. I don't think anybody expected the Blackhawks to be playoff contenders
Right.
this year. They're not at that step of the rebuild, but they did expect progress. And we certainly were not seeing as a team that progress that, they were in last place in the Central Division and just not looking like they were any closer to contending for a playoff spot than they were a year ago. So having, Bedard not making progress and the team as a whole not making progress, last in the league with 18 points, something had to give. And Luke Richardson now out of a job. How surprised were you that they went the interim route and promoted Anders Sorensen from Rockford?
So I think that it was the right move because Rockford has been a pretty successful AHL team. They've made the playoffs pretty consistently. Right now, they're a little iffy overall just because they've had like a little bit of changeover with affiliation and such. But I think that, he has a history of having a really successful AHL team and can be a head coach. And he's the guy working with young players, right?
Right.
So if your team is filled with young players who you need to take the next step, who else but somebody who's already dealing with young players who can already be in that mindset to finish out the season? And I think then you just see how the rest of the season goes. And then you go from there in terms of do you, hire him on as full time and remove the interim tag, right?
Yeah, and not only has he worked with young players, he specifically worked with these young players, or many of them, as they came up through the ranks. So a lot of the players are familiar with what he's asking of them, the way he operates, the system he wants to play, and that should make this transition a little bit smoother, I would think.
Yeah, and you look at their stats right now, the Blackhawks, they're not only last in the league in standings, but have the lowest goals per game. And when you have guys on your team that can score goals here, and they're just not doing it to the point where now you have a 4-game losing streak again. You've lost 10 of your last 13. Like at a certain point, like scoring becomes the big issue here, right?
And you would think the talent is there. There is a lot of young talent, high draft picks on this team. And that takes us back to the lack of development and progress that these young players are making. So all roads seem to lead to Rome. And the decision,
Yeah.
I think, made a lot of sense, even if it was difficult, because let's face another fact, Luke Richardson is a quality person and a quality coach. It's just not the right time and place for him to continue in this role with this team.
Yeah, and right now, ownership in Chicago is supporting Kyle Davidson, the GM, in these decisions. But I do think there's a point where then the GM needs to take some ownership because, there's some veterans on this team that are there that are maybe not pulling their weight either. And to the point where they had scratched Taylor Hall, like healthy scratch Taylor
Yeah.
Hall. Remember if it was last week or the week before, but it's a recent occurrence. And that's when you see like grasping at straws to try and make things work, and it looks like they just didn't for him. But I think that does, put Kyle Davidson on the hot seat a little bit, probably heading into next season. Like whatever moves the Blackhawks make this upcoming off season are going to weigh really heavily on if he keeps his job at that point.
And do you think he gets to hire the next coach? If this season doesn't get any better, does
Could
Richardson,
be.
do you get the same GM to hire the next coach, or do we change regimes entirely?
Well, that's a big question, right? And I think that Kyle Davidson has to sell himself to ownership and say, "No, I do have a plan and here's what changes we're going to make and give me a shot." And then, Rocky Wirtz can decide to do whatever he wants at that point.
It's good to be the king, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's an interesting time in Chicago, definitely at a crossroads, and Davidson is probably on the hot seat now after making this move.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, there's also turmoil in New York for the Rangers and Islanders. We're going to get to the Rangers first, with it looking like the captain, Jacob Trouba, will be heading out. And we will get to that coming up next.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you could check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And hockey fans, you could use your knowledge of the game and of your favorite team to find exciting bets on FanDuel. Just head on over to the website or the app and check out the latest odds. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
So the New York Rangers are in the process of getting rid of their captain, defenseman Jacob Trouba, right now. And as of recording, we know that that's in process. We do not know if it's going to be a trade or have him go through waivers. Things are changing as we speak, but we do have John Chick of Locked On New York Rangers to give us his thoughts as we are in this turmoil.
Hey, what is going on, Ranger fans? It's John Chick with Locked On New York Rangers, reacting to the big breaking news that apparently Jacob Trouba has indeed been waived by the team. It's kind of unfortunate that it got to this point, and I do feel for him certainly on some levels. I think being captain of the Rangers certainly meant something to Jacob Trouba, but the way things have gone recently, the team's falling apart, and his play just has been subpar, to say the least. I mean, that's probably the nicest way that I can put it. So, I mean, it is what it is. Rangers are back in action tonight against the Penguins. We'll see how they go into battle without their captain. Curious to see if they name a new captain at some point this season. Maybe they wait till next season. Who's to say for sure? If I'm picking a new captain, I'm thinking maybe Lafreniere, maybe Trocheck. I mean, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But for the time being, yeah, Jacob Trouba looks like is now an ex-Ranger. And we will be talking about all this and more on the next episode of Locked On New York Rangers. Do not miss it.
All right, so they haven't technically put him on waivers yet, but I do think that if a trade is not negotiated before then, that is exactly what will happen with Jacob Trouba. And we've seen teams trade their captains in the past. Sometimes it's just due to wanting to trade them to a team to give them a chance to win a cup, in a more gracious kind of trade, and sometimes contracts get in the way. And that's partially what's happening with Jacob Trouba. Is the New York Rangers, while they are falling apart to some degree, I don't think it's as dire as John makes it out here for the Rangers, but I do think that things are very messy there. And when Jacob Trouba has an $8 million cap hit, and this is one of his worst seasons, it's hard to swallow having that around, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Rangers are in turmoil in part because expectations were so high. This is a
Right.
team that won the President's Trophy last year, that was a contender for the Stanley Cup, reached the conference final, and expectations were that they were going to be at or near that level again, and they just aren't. And, you look at that big contract, that $8 million cap hit. Is he even giving you, the way he's playing on the ice, half of that value on a game by game basis? Not right now. Something's got to change. And this is probably the first move. And a lot of it is going to depend on Trouba. He has a 15 or 16 team no trade list, and they're asking him to waive that no trade list to make a trade. Otherwise, they will have to waive him.
Right. And the Rangers and this whole scenario is like a little bit of deja vu, right? Because this is the same thing that happened with Barclay Goodrow, where they couldn't get him to waive a no trade clause. And so he got waived and the Sharks picked him up. And so the Rangers got away scot-free without having to pay Goudreau,
Right.
and they didn't have to give anything up to take, for somebody to eat salary for them, right? So it was a little bit of finding a loophole. And so for the Rangers to potentially do this again, I think is, a little bit alarming in terms of cap circumvention around the league, right?
But who's going to take on that contract at this
Mm.
point? And if nobody does, do they stash him in the minors and get partial cap relief that way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's like, who has a need for a big defenseman who's not producing at the moment and who takes a lot of pims? That is the other big question here, right?
Yeah, I mean, are there teams that could use the defenseman? Yeah. Does a fresh start, in a new team potentially help snap him out of this melees that he's been playing in? Maybe, but that's $8 million. Not a lot of teams have that kind of cap space, A, and
Yeah.
B, out of those teams that do, how many of them are willing to take a chance and gamble $8 million in cap space on a 30-year-old defenseman who's slumping?
Right. And you look at the teams that do have the cap space right now, obviously the Columbus Blue Jackets come to mind. But, that's a big ask. And there's going to be like a backroom deal on the other end for them to do it as a favor to the New York Rangers because that's in division.
Yeah, that is in division. And I mean, in theory, that gives Trouba a shot at revenge because he can go out there and face the Rangers 3 or 4 times and have a chance to play against them and maybe defeat them and help the Blue Jackets make progress toward catching the Rangers. And they're not that far behind them in the standings right now, but
Right.
but in the long run, I don't think too many people expect Columbus will finish ahead of the Rangers in the standings. There are not a lot of teams who really have the option and the inclination to pick him up. So does he end up in Hartford with the Wolfpack if that's the case?
Well, and does he report? That's a
Right.
whole other thing too.
Yeah.
So, I think that it's there's a lot of tough decisions that Truba has to make for himself. Is he willing to waive this no trade clause if somehow they can get him something extra and as incentive to do it on the other end of the trade? He has one more year left on the contract too. It's not just 8 million for this year. There's one additional year. So this team, whoever they are, is going to have to eat that unless they can negotiate a trade where the Rangers retain salary. And I do think, the Rangers, they sped up their rebuild slash and turned it into a retool and were able to kind of get back into things quickly. But I think that's had a price, right? Where, it wasn't done quote unquote the right way in hockey terms. And when you do it the right way, sometimes you end up like the Red Wings, where you're in like year 6 of the plan, right?
Right.
And there's still issues going on. And sometimes you have success like other teams have had, doing a proper rebuild. But it's a gamble whichever way you do it. But I think the Rangers are kind of, where the rubber meets the road here in terms of the consequences of how they got to where they were last season. And, I said that I don't think the Rangers situation is as dire as they make it out to be. I do think you're right, Gil, in terms of it's in comparison to last season, but there's basically in this division the top 3 teams and then everybody else in
Right.
one big mush, right? There isn't much dividing those bottom 5 teams in the division at this moment. And so there are opportunities here. And I think, there are other fingers to be pointed besides at Jacob Trouba
Oh,
here.
no doubt. There's a lot of other fingers to be pointed, but no production for $8 million. That's the first finger that's going to get pointed.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. But it's a very interesting story developing with the New York Rangers. Will this help the Rangers at all moving forward, or is this just we've got to, cut off the thing that's hurting us the most, and then maybe that will help I don't think talking about a future captain of the Rangers is helpful at this time, but who knows? Maybe the Rangers like having a captain. We'll see. But yeah, lots of questions for this team moving forward.
No doubt. And there's still time for the Rangers to salvage their season. And if they do make the playoffs, if they get hot at the right time, I mean, having the goaltending duo that they have would keep them in any playoff series, you would think. So, you make this move now with the hopes that it serves as a wake-up call. If we can trade or waive our captain, every other player on this team is on notice that they need to be responsible or they could be next.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to go to the other New York team, the New York Islanders. And Gil, you're going to give us a little insight into what's going on behind the scenes there coming up next. All right, Gil. The Islanders had a very tough game last night. Did not go well for them at all. I think it inspired you to make a very good rant on your show, Locked On Islanders. And let's take a look at what you had to say there.
Bringing back this same roster is foolish. And if management, if ownership doesn't realize that this team maxed out its capabilities 4 years ago when they went to the conference final for the second year in a row, and they're not willing to make some changes. If Lou Lamoriello will not make changes, then ownership has to make changes, and Lou Lamoriello has to be shown the door, because you cannot continue along this route. The longer you wait to make changes, to start trading away some of the older guys on bad contracts, to create cap space, to create room for younger, faster, more skilled players. And it may take 2, 3, 4 years to get to a contending spot. But I can tell you right now, if you don't do that, it'll take 5 or 6 years. And it'll be more difficult because you need to start accumulating picks and prospects.
Those are fighting words, Gil. And I think, again, from an outside perspective here, take us through the journey of when Lou Lamoriello was hired as GM of this team to what has happened now, like the expectations based on his past GM experience and the kind of team that you think the Islanders should have been building this time. And where did he go wrong? Because my recollection is that Islanders fans were happy with the hire at the time.
Oh, and they were. And, he built this team pretty darn well once he got here. He ended up making the playoffs in his first season after hiring Barry Trotz. They lost in the second round, so they won a playoff series. Then they make back-to-back appearances in the conference final. And the year after that, they end up missing the playoffs entirely. And then 2 years of barely making the playoffs and first-round exits. Now, keep in mind, the 2 years that the Islanders did go to the conference final were the 2 years that were COVID-shortened seasons.
Right.
And the Islanders would not have even made the playoffs the first of those 2 years if they
That's
didn't
true.
extend the pool. So even though the Islanders made back-to-back conference final, they were never more than a fringe playoff team in the standings. They just went on a roll at the right time, and having good goaltending, obviously, a big part of that. But the problem is this is an aging core that hasn't won a playoff series in the last 3 seasons. And there are a lot of guys like Jacob Trouba who are on bad contracts where they're not playing up to their cap hit. And when you have an aging core and you keep doubling down on that core and saying, I believe in this core, what's the definition of insanity again? I mean, if you don't win a playoff series in 3 straight years and you only your maximum seems to be barely squeaking into the playoffs each year, what are you trying to accomplish here by doubling down on bringing back that same core?
Right. And to me, one of the major issues with the Islanders is the drafting and the lack of holding on to those draft assets, right? It's that the Islanders have had like multiple years without a first round draft pick. And so, how do you have a cohesive system with young talent coming up to join those veterans that Lou did a great job acquiring, some solid veterans and the whole Tavares thing was an issue in terms of him leaving and, creating a vacuum there. I thought that there was the right approach in terms of having the right veteran core, but the young talent was nowhere to be found as part of this process because they didn't have any to pick from in the draft.
Well, what Lou did to sort of maintain the team and the core, he traded away 4 consecutive first round draft picks, a couple of
Like, how
second
do you
and
do
third.
that?
Yeah. And again, it's trading away those picks to keep the team fighting for 7th place in the conference or 8th place in the conference. It's not like this team was ever one player away from being an elite Stanley Cup contender. And in a way, making those playoff runs almost hurt the ability to move on, because I think Lou thought this team was this close to winning a Stanley Cup when in reality, talent-wise, they were never elite. They were just pretty good. And now you're stuck with an older bunch of guys who are pretty good. And look, this team always struggled to score goals, always lacked team speed. And
Right.
now 3 years after going on those playoff runs, the core is older. So it's not like any one of those trades where they dealt the first round picks away were bad in and of themselves. But when you put them all together and you don't get past the muddy middle, you're sinking, and you're not. The Islanders prospect pool is near the bottom of the league. And that's even after drafting Cole Iserman this year, who was the first round pick they kept in 5 seasons.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, the big question now is what do the Islanders do next? And is there room to fire Lou?
There has to be. I mean, you already have some tension apparently between Patrick Waugh and Lou Lamoriello, where Waugh actually said in a post-game press conference, "I will coach the team that Lou gives me. I love these guys, but like nobody comes out and says I will coach the team the GM gives me." That is it's not a direct swipe at the GM, but it's pretty close. And
Well, and is that setting himself up in a position to not get swept up in, in whatever massive change happens eventually? Or
right.
does Lou broker a deal to walk away gracefully at the end of this, or quote unquote gracefully at the end of
Right.
this season, right?
Well, look, at his age, all Lou has to do to walk away gracefully is say, "I'm retiring." I mean, that,
Right,
it's not
exactly.
like he's 40 and he's looking at his next job. He's 82, 83 years old. This is probably his last job unless he moves on to be, president or special advisor or whatever title they want to give him. So, Lou can walk away gracefully at any point. I just, if Lou Lamoriello doesn't make some moves at the trade deadline to make this team younger, faster, and more skilled, then he should not be the guy making those decisions at the trade deadline. And therein lies the big problem.
Yeah, I think so too. It's just like, how do you move on when you have this guy who's a legend, seems entrenched in this role, but he, in theory, should be retired at this point? How do you convince him to walk away?
Yeah, and he has come out and said, "I do not believe in retooling or rebuilding," and that is the crux of the problem. He may only be the GM even if things were good for 1 more year, 2 more years, whatever it's going to be, but it's his responsibility, regardless of whether he's still working for the team at that point, to set the team up to be as good as it can be. And if he's only looking at this year and not looking to the future, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tough road ahead for the New York Islanders, but Gil will keep track of it on Locked On Islanders, and he will also be back Monday to discuss goings on around the NHL with hosts from around the Locked On NHL Network. We will be back next Friday as well for the Friday show of Locked On NHL. Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen. For your next listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert. Get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a great weekend, everyone.